When people look at the headlines today, there's a tendency to be depressed. You see the rise of autocrats like Orban. You see kind of a loss of leadership from the United States or the UK. You see the proliferation of certain major conflicts in places like Yemen or Syria. I think the real news over the last year has been the rise of the resistance to these trends. People are going onto the streets, they're voting, you see governments organizing, all of this in defense of human rights. Governments violate human rights because it's convenient. It's a way of clinging to power, it's a way of getting rid of the opposition, it's the way of promoting one's corruption. But there is this pushback. And what we've seen is that this pushback has been successful in raising the cost of human rights abuse. Today, the world's worst humanitarian crisis is probably Yemen, where there are millions of people facing famine because of the bombing and blockade imposed by the Saudi-led coalition. A number of nations have come forward. The Netherlands led an effort at the UN Human Rights Council that launched a war crimes investigation. The Jamal Khashoggi murder has suddenly gotten people to recognize how awful the Saudi Crown Prince government is. And all of this has so intensified the pressure that the Saudi Crown Prince actually agreed to a ceasefire in Hodeidah port, the principal port in western Yemen, which is the key to breaking the famine. So it's made a difference. Now you can see similar things going on in other parts of the world. For example, in Venezuela, where the Maduro government has utterly decimated what was once an oil-rich country. It now is plagued by hyperinflation, by shortages of food and medicine, and even now by a blackout of the electrical system. What we've seen is a group of Latin American democracies band together under the name of the so-called Lima Group. And they have, for the first time really in Latin American history, imposed intense multilateral pressure on one of their neighbors. So they got Venezuela condemned by the UN Human Rights Council. They referred Venezuela to the International Criminal Court, the first time third-party governments have ever done that. They've begun to impose targeted sanctions on Maduro's cronies. And all of this has left Maduro isolated. He's still clinging to power, but he's got no regional support. Orban is following the classic autocrat's playbook. That is, he gains power by demonizing an unpopular minority, in this case migrants and refugees. Once in power, he then tries to undermine the checks and balances on his authority. So he's attacking the independence of the judges. He's attacking journalists, and he's behind a consolidation of government-controlled media. He's been attacking activists. He's trying to close, or is in the process of closing, Central European University. Now, the real question is, how is the European Union going to respond? The good news was that the European Parliament, by the required two-thirds majority, began so-called Article 7 sanctions proceedings under the leading EU treaty. But that's just the beginning, really. What's needed now is really much more intense spotlighting of what Orban is doing. Hungary is one of the largest per capita recipients of EU funding. And Orban uses that to build football stadiums left and right to reward his cronies, but not to meet the needs of the Hungarian people. And the key question for Brussels and the other elements of the European Union is whether it's going to continue to allow Orban to do that. It's going to continue subsidizing these anti-democratic efforts, or is it going to draw the line as a way of putting real pressure on Orban to stop? Governments have lots of reasons not to respect human rights because it makes them easier to stay in power. Now, what we've seen over the last year is that pressure can work, that even in these tough times, you can build serious pressure on governments to change. Probably the most dangerous situation on earth today is Idlib province in northwestern Syria. This is the last area held by anti-government forces. There are some 3 million civilians there. The Syrians and the Russians were threatening to retake this area in their classic way by indiscriminately bombing civilians and civilian institutions. Now, through intense pressure, led by Germany and Turkey and others, Putin agreed to a ceasefire in mid-September. And that ceasefire has largely held to this day. Those 3 million people are still living there reasonably safely. Now, this shows that by spotlighting the problem, by spreading word of it in the media, by enlisting powerful governments, you can put sufficient pressure, even on a government like Russia's, to force it to pay greater respect to human rights. I could give a million stories like that. That's the reason I have hope, because there is always something you can do to increase the cost of human rights violations, and if you increase that cost enough, governments will stop violating the rights of their people.